Mother Bear paused her own treatment to feed the baby first. What happened next was shocking. Let us know where you're watching from. If you love my content, consider supporting it with a super thanks. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe. It'll help us to remain in touch with amazing people like you. The old wooden cabin sat deep in the heart of Pine Ridge Forest, where the morning mist still clung to the trees like forgotten dreams. Dr. Ruby Sinclair had chosen this remote location for her wildlife rehabilitation center precisely because it was far from the noise and chaos of the city. The smell of pine needles and fresh mountain air usually brought her peace, but today something felt different. Ruby wiped the sweat from her forehead as she carefully examined the large brown bear lying on the makeshift operating table in her clinic. The female bear had been brought in 3 days ago by a group of hikers who found her collapsed near the hiking trail, her left paw caught in an old rusted trap. The wound was deep, infected, and required immediate surgery. "Easy, girl, easy," Ruby whispered softly, her hands gentle as she cleaned the fresh surgical site. The bear's breathing was shallow but steady. The anesthesia was wearing off slowly, and Ruby knew she would need to keep the animal sedated for at least another day to prevent any complications. What made this case particularly heartbreaking was the small cub that had been found hiding nearby. The little one, barely 3 months old, had refused to leave his mother's side. Ruby had set up a temporary enclosure right next to the recovery area so the cub could stay close while his mother healed. The sound of crying suddenly pierced the quiet morning air. Ruby's head snapped up from her work. It wasn't the cub making that noise. The crying was coming from the back room of the cabin, where she had been caring for baby Emma. Emma was only 6 months old, and her story was just as tragic as the bear's. The baby had been found abandoned on the steps of the ranger station 2 weeks ago, wrapped in nothing but a thin blanket with a note that simply read, "Please take care of her. I can't anymore." Since the nearest town was over 60 miles away, and the roads were currently washed out from recent storms, Ruby had no choice but to care for the infant herself until help could arrive. She had called for assistance, but the rescue team wouldn't be able to reach them for at least another week. The baby's crying grew louder and more desperate. Ruby looked down at the sedated mother bear, her hands still covered in surgical gloves. She couldn't leave the bear's side right now, not when the animal was still coming out of anesthesia. Any sudden movement or noise could cause the bear to panic and injure herself further. "Hold on, sweetie," Ruby called out toward the back room, hoping somehow the baby would understand and calm down. But Emma's cries only intensified. That's when Ruby noticed something strange. The bear cub, who had been sleeping peacefully in his enclosure, suddenly stood up. His small dark eyes were alert and focused, not on his mother, but on the direction of Emma's crying. The cub began pacing back and forth in his enclosure, making soft whimpering sounds. He kept looking toward the back room, then back at his unconscious mother, as if trying to understand why she wasn't responding to the distress call of another baby. Ruby watched in fascination as the cub's behavior became more agitated. The little bear began pawing at the gate of his enclosure, trying desperately to get out. His mother, still heavily sedated, made no movement except for the steady rise and fall of her chest. Emma's crying reached a fever pitch, the sound echoing through the cabin walls. Ruby felt torn between her two patients. She couldn't leave the mother bear, but the baby clearly needed attention. The cub suddenly stopped pacing and sat down, tilting his head as if listening intently to something Ruby couldn't hear. Then, without warning, he let out a low, mournful sound that Ruby had never heard from such a young bear before. As if responding to her baby's call, the mother bear's eyes slowly began to flutter open. Ruby's heart skipped a beat as she watched the massive bear slowly regain consciousness. This was the critical moment she had been dreading. Bears coming out of anesthesia could be unpredictable and dangerous, especially a mother bear who might feel threatened or confused about her surroundings. "Stay calm," Ruby whispered to herself, keeping her movements slow and deliberate. She reached for the emergency sedative she always kept nearby, just in case the bear became aggressive. But something in the bear's eyes stopped her cold. The mother bear wasn't looking at Ruby with fear or aggression. Instead, her dark, intelligent eyes were focused entirely on the sound of Emma's crying coming from the back room. The bear's ears twitched with each sob, and Ruby could see the animal's maternal instincts kicking in despite her weakened state. Emma's cries had taken on a desperate quality now, the kind of wailing that could break anyone's heart. Ruby knew the baby was hungry. It had been almost 4 hours since her last feeding, and the formula was sitting in the back room, just out of reach while Ruby tended to her surgical patient. The mother bear made a soft rumbling sound deep in her throat, almost like a gentle growl, but Ruby recognized it as the kind of vocalization mother bears made to comfort their cubs. The sound was directed not toward her own baby, but toward the crying infant in the other room. "This is impossible," Ruby breathed, watching in amazement as the bear struggled to lift her massive head. The surgical site on her paw was still fresh, the stitches barely 12 hours old, but the bear seemed determined to move despite the obvious pain. The cub, sensing his mother's awakening, pressed himself against the bars of his enclosure, whimpering softly. His small paws reached through the gaps, trying to touch his mother, but she was just inches too far away. That's when Ruby noticed something that made her blood run cold. A thin line of red was beginning to seep through the white bandages wrapped around the mother bear's injured paw. The bear's movements were causing the surgical site to bleed again. "No, no, no," Ruby said urgently, moving closer to check the wound. "You need to stay still, Mama. Your stitches are going to tear." But the mother bear paid no attention to Ruby's words or to her own pain. With tremendous effort, she began to push herself up into a sitting position, her powerful muscles straining against her injuries. Each movement sent fresh waves of blood through the bandages. Emma's crying suddenly stopped for a moment, as if the baby could sense that someone was trying to help her. In that brief silence, Ruby heard something that made her question everything she thought she knew about animal behavior. The mother bear was making soft, rhythmic sounds, the same kind of gentle cooing noises that human mothers made to soothe their babies. The bear was trying to comfort Emma from across the cabin, despite never having seen the human infant. "How is this possible?" Ruby whispered, her scientific mind struggling to process what she was witnessing. She had worked with bears for 15 years, had studied their behavior extensively, but she had never seen anything like this. The cub seemed to understand something that Ruby didn't. He stopped whimpering and began making his own soft sounds, as if trying to help his mother communicate with the crying baby. The two bears created a gentle chorus of comfort sounds, their voices carrying through the cabin walls. For a moment, Emma's crying subsided, replaced by small hiccuping sounds that indicated she was listening to the unfamiliar but soothing voices. Ruby felt tears prick her eyes as she realized what was happening. These wild animals were trying to comfort a human baby they had never met. But the moment of peace was short-lived. Emma's hunger was too strong, and she began crying again with renewed intensity. This time, the sound seemed to physically pain the mother bear. She let out a low moan and tried to stand up completely. "Please don't," Ruby pleaded, reaching out to gently place her hand on the bear's massive shoulder. "You're going to hurt yourself worse." The bear looked directly into Ruby's eyes, and what Ruby saw there took her breath away. It wasn't the wild, primal gaze of a dangerous animal. It was the look of a mother in distress, desperate to help another mother's child. The bleeding from the bear's paw was getting worse now, dripping steadily onto the floor of the clinic. Ruby knew she had to make a choice: sedate the bear to prevent further injury, or trust this incredible animal and somehow find a way to help both her patients. Emma's crying reached a crescendo that seemed to echo through every corner of the cabin. The mother bear responded with a sound Ruby had never heard before. A deep, mournful call that seemed to carry all the pain and love of every mother who had ever lost a child. In that moment, Ruby made a decision that would change everything. She looked at the bleeding bear, then toward the room where Emma was crying, and slowly began to remove her surgical gloves. "All right, Mama," she said softly to the bear. "Let's go take care of that baby together." As Ruby spoke these words, something extraordinary happened. The mother bear, despite her pain and weakness, managed to stand on her 3 good legs. She looked toward the cub's enclosure, then back at Ruby, as if asking permission for something that defied all logic and natural law. The cub, understanding his mother's intent in the way that animals sometimes do, began pawing more frantically at his enclosure gate. His small cries joined the symphony of distress that filled the cabin. Emma's hungry wails, his mother's pained breathing, and his own desperate whimpers. Ruby's hands trembled as she reached for the latch of the cub's enclosure. Every instinct she had as a wildlife professional told her this was dangerous, that she was breaking every safety protocol she had ever learned. But her heart told her something different. The moment the gate opened, the cub rushed to his mother's side, nuzzling against her massive form. The mother bear nuzzled him back briefly, then began moving slowly toward the back room where Emma's cries were coming from. Each step was agony for the injured bear. Ruby could see the pain in her eyes, could hear it in the way her breathing became labored. The bandage around her paw was now completely soaked with blood, leaving a trail of red droplets on the wooden floor. "This is insane," Ruby whispered to herself, but she followed the bear family as they made their way toward Emma's room. She kept the emergency sedative ready, just in case the situation turned dangerous, but something in her gut told her that these animals meant no harm. The mother bear paused at the doorway to Emma's room, her massive frame filling the entire entrance. Inside, the 6-month-old baby lay in her makeshift crib, a wooden box lined with soft blankets that Ruby had fashioned from supplies in the cabin. Emma's face was red from crying, her tiny fists waving in the air as she wailed her distress. The moment she saw the enormous bear in the doorway, she stopped crying and stared with the wide-eyed wonder that only babies possess. The silence that followed was profound. Ruby held her breath, watching as the mother bear and the human infant regarded each other for the first time. The cub pressed close to his mother's side, his dark eyes also fixed on the tiny human. Then, in a movement so gentle it brought tears to Ruby's eyes, the mother bear lowered her massive head and made the softest whimpering sound Ruby had ever heard. It was the sound a mother makes when meeting her newborn for the first time. Emma, responding to this gentle greeting, stopped crying completely and made a small cooing sound back. That's when Ruby noticed the bottle of formula sitting on the shelf beside Emma's crib, the feeding that had been delayed because of the bear's surgery. The bottle was just out of Emma's reach, but perfectly positioned where the mother bear could see it. The bear's intelligent eyes moved from the baby to the bottle, then back to the baby again. Ruby watched in amazement as the animal seemed to understand exactly what the crying infant needed. What happened next would haunt Ruby's dreams and change her understanding of the natural world forever. The mother bear, despite her massive size and obvious pain, began to move with the careful precision of a creature who understood the fragility of what lay before her. Ruby watched in stunned silence as the bear slowly approached Emma's crib, each step deliberate and measured. The wooden floorboards creaked under the bear's weight, but she seemed to sense that sudden movements or loud noises might frighten the baby. Her injured paw left small spots of blood with each step, yet she pressed forward with a determination that took Ruby's breath away. Emma, still lying in her makeshift crib, had stopped crying entirely now. Her bright blue eyes followed the massive bear's movements with the fearless curiosity that only infants possess. She made small babbling sounds, as if trying to communicate with this enormous new presence in her world. The cub stayed close to his mother's side, but Ruby noticed something remarkable in his behavior. The young bear wasn't playful or excited as cubs usually were. Instead, he moved with an unusual solemnity, as if he understood the gravity of what was happening. When the mother bear reached the side of Emma's crib, she paused and looked back at Ruby. There was something almost human in that gaze, a silent request for permission, an acknowledgement that she was crossing a boundary between species that was rarely, if ever, crossed. Ruby found herself nodding slowly, though she couldn't quite believe what she was agreeing to. "It's okay, Mama," she whispered. "She needs help." The bear turned back to Emma and began making soft, low rumbling sounds deep in her chest. Ruby recognized these as the same vocalizations mother bears used to calm their cubs when they were distressed or frightened. The sound seemed to resonate through the small room, creating an atmosphere of unexpected peace. Emma responded immediately to these gentle sounds. Her tiny body relaxed, and she made happy gurgling noises back at the bear. It was as if the two were having a conversation in a language older than words. But then Ruby noticed something that made her heart race with a mixture of wonder and concern. The mother bear was looking intently at the bottle of formula on the shelf, then back at Emma, then at her own cub. The bear's intelligence was clearly working through a problem, trying to figure out how to help the hungry baby. The cub seemed to understand his mother's dilemma. He began making small whimpering sounds and pawing at the air in the direction of the bottle. His mother looked down at him, then back at the bottle, and Ruby could almost see the gears turning in the animal's mind. What happened next defied everything Ruby thought she knew about wild animal behavior. The mother bear, moving with painstaking care, began to rise up on her hind legs. The movement sent obvious waves of pain through her injured body. Ruby could see her muscles trembling with the effort, and the bloodstain on her bandage grew larger. But the bear persisted, stretching her uninjured front paw toward the shelf where the bottle sat. "No, don't hurt yourself," Ruby started to say, stepping forward to help, but she stopped when she saw the look of fierce determination in the bear's eyes. This was something the animal needed to do herself. The bear's paw was just inches from the bottle when her injured leg gave out slightly, causing her to stumble. The movement sent a fresh wave of blood seeping through her bandages, and Ruby heard the bear's sharp intake of breath from the pain. Emma, sensing the distress of her would-be caretaker, began to fuss again, though not with the desperate crying from before. These were small, worried sounds, the kind a baby makes when they sense something is wrong with their caregiver. The cub, watching his mother struggle, did something that made Ruby's jaw drop. The young bear positioned himself beneath his mother's injured side, offering his small body a support so she could reach the bottle without putting all her weight on her wounded paw. With her cub's help, the mother bear was able to carefully grasp the bottle between her teeth. The sight of this massive, wild predator holding a baby bottle with the gentleness of an experienced nurse was so surreal that Ruby had to blink several times to make sure she wasn't hallucinating. Slowly, carefully, the mother bear lowered herself back down to all fours and moved toward Emma's crib with the bottle still held gently in her mouth. Each movement was deliberate and controlled, as if she understood that one wrong move could harm the fragile human infant. Emma's eyes lit up at the sight of her bottle, and she made excited cooing sounds while reaching her tiny hands toward it. The mother bear lowered her massive head toward the crib, but then paused, seeming to realize that she couldn't safely transfer the bottle to the baby while it was still in her mouth. The bear looked up at Ruby with what could only be described as a pleading expression. She was asking for help, acknowledging that despite her best efforts, she needed human assistance to complete this act of cross-species caregiving. Ruby's hands shook as she reached out to take the bottle from the bear's mouth. The animal released it immediately, then backed away slightly to give Ruby room to work. But she didn't go far. The bear positioned herself where she could watch every movement, as if supervising to make sure the baby was properly cared for. "I can't believe this is happening," Ruby murmured as she gently lifted Emma from her crib and settled into the rocking chair beside it. The baby immediately latched onto the bottle and began drinking hungrily, her distressed cries finally silenced. The mother bear watched this feeding process with intense interest, her dark eyes following every movement. Occasionally, she would make soft, rumbling sounds that seemed to encourage Emma to keep drinking. The cub had settled beside his mother, both of them creating a protective semicircle around Ruby and the baby. As Emma drank, Ruby found herself studying the bears more closely. There was something in their behavior that went beyond simple maternal instinct, or even learned responses. The way they watched Emma, the gentle sounds they made, the careful coordination between mother and cub. It was as if they had appointed themselves as guardians of this human infant. "How is this possible?" Ruby whispered more to herself than to anyone else. "Bears don't adopt human babies. This doesn't happen in nature." But even as she said the words, Ruby remembered stories she had heard from other wildlife researchers, tales that were usually dismissed as folklore or exaggeration. Stories of wild animals caring for human children lost in the wilderness, of cross-species adoptions that defied scientific explanation. Could it be that such things weren't as impossible as she had always believed? Emma finished about half the bottle before her eyelids began to grow heavy. The combination of a full stomach and the gentle rhythmic sounds the bears were making seemed to be lulling her toward sleep. Ruby carefully lifted the baby to her shoulder to burp her, a routine so normal and human that it felt strange to be performing it under the watchful eyes of two wild bears. The mother bear's attention was riveted on this process. When Emma let out a small burp, the bear made an approving rumbling sound, as if she understood that this was a necessary part of feeding a baby. When Ruby gently patted Emma's back, the bear mimicked the motion in the air with her uninjured paw. "You understand, don't you?" Ruby said softly to the bear. "You know she's just a baby who needs taking care of." The bear's response was to move closer and begin making the soft, rhythmic breathing sounds that mother bears use to help their cubs fall asleep. Within minutes, Emma's eyes had closed completely, and she was sleeping peacefully in Ruby's arms. But as Ruby stood to place Emma back in her crib, she noticed something that made her heart skip a beat. The mother bear's injured paw was bleeding much more heavily now. The white bandage was completely soaked through, and drops of blood were forming a small pool on the wooden floor. The bear had reopened her surgical wounds in her effort to help Emma, and now she was in serious danger of bleeding too much or developing a life-threatening infection. "Oh no," Ruby breathed, gently placing Emma back in her crib before turning to examine the bear's injury. "What have you done to yourself, Mama?" The mother bear looked down at her wounded paw, as if noticing the bleeding for the first time. She had been so focused on helping Emma that she'd ignored her own body's warning signals about the damage she was causing to herself. Ruby quickly moved to her medical supplies, gathering fresh bandages and antiseptic. But as she approached the bear with the medical equipment, something unexpected happened. The mother bear backed away from Ruby, moving protectively toward Emma's crib. Her body language had changed from cooperative to defensive, and Ruby suddenly realized what was happening. The bear's maternal instincts had expanded to include Emma. She now saw the human baby as a part of her family unit, and she was prepared to defend her new charge even from the person who had been helping them both. "It's okay," Ruby said gently, raising her hands to show she meant no harm. "I just want to help your paw. You're bleeding too much." But the bear remained positioned between Ruby and Emma's crib, her dark eyes watchful and alert despite the obvious pain she was experiencing. The cub pressed close to his mother's side, adding his small but determined presence to the protective barrier. Ruby found herself in an impossible situation. The bear desperately needed medical attention, but she wouldn't allow Ruby near her while she perceived Emma to be in potential danger. And with each passing minute, the bear was losing more blood. That's when Ruby heard a sound that made her blood run cold. The distant rumble of vehicles approaching through the forest. The rescue team she had called for days ago was finally arriving, but they would be expecting to find only a wildlife researcher and an abandoned baby. Instead, they were about to walk into a situation unlike anything they had ever encountered. A situation where a wild bear had claimed a human infant as her own and was prepared to fight anyone who tried to separate them. Ruby looked at the bleeding bear, at the peacefully sleeping baby, and at the loyal cub who had helped make this impossible scene happen. In a few minutes, everything would change. The authorities would arrive, protocols would be followed, and this miraculous moment of cross-species connection would be lost forever, unless Ruby could find a way to protect all of them. The sound of car doors slamming echoed through the forest, followed by voices calling her name. Ruby's time was running out, and she had to make a choice that would determine the fate of everyone in that small cabin, human and bear alike. As footsteps approached the cabin door, Ruby took a deep breath and made a decision that would change all their lives in ways she could never have imagined. "Wait!" Ruby called out loudly, hoping to stop the rescue team before they entered. She could hear the footsteps pause outside the door, followed by muffled voices discussing whether something might be wrong. The mother bear's ears perked up at the sound of strangers approaching, and her protective stance became even more pronounced. She positioned herself directly in front of Emma's crib, her massive body creating an impenetrable wall between the sleeping baby and any potential threat. The cub moved to flank his mother's left side, his small but determined presence adding to the defensive formation. Ruby's mind raced as she tried to figure out how to handle this situation. She knew that if the rescue team saw a wild bear standing over a human baby, their first instinct would be to neutralize what they would perceive as a threat. They wouldn't understand the incredible bond that had formed, wouldn't see the gentle protection the bear was offering. "Dr. Sinclair?" came a voice from outside. Ruby recognized it as Captain Jake Morrison from the local search and rescue unit. "Is everything all right in there? We heard you calling." "Everything's fine, Jake," Ruby called back, though her voice was shaky with nervous tension. "I just need a few more minutes to secure my patients before you come in." There was a pause, and Ruby could hear hushed conversation outside the door. She knew they would find her request strange. She had never asked for time to secure patients before, but she was counting on their trust in her professional judgment to buy her a few precious minutes. The mother bear seemed to sense the tension in Ruby's voice. She turned her massive head to look at Ruby, and in those intelligent dark eyes, Ruby saw something that made her heart ache. The bear was asking her to protect not just her own cub, but the human baby she had claimed as well. "I won't let them separate you," Ruby whispered to the bear, though she had no idea how she was going to keep that promise. The bear's bleeding had worsened during the stress of the last few minutes. Ruby could see that the animal was becoming weaker, her stance less steady than before. If she didn't get medical attention soon, she could collapse from blood loss. But any attempt to approach with medical supplies was met with a defensive growl that made it clear the bear would not allow anyone near Emma. Ruby's eyes fell on the radio sitting on her desk, the same radio she had used to call for the rescue team. An idea began to form in her mind, dangerous and unprecedented, but possibly their only hope. She picked up the radio and switched to the emergency frequency that connected her directly to the State Wildlife Management Office. If anyone could understand the impossible situation she was describing, it would be Dr. Marcus Webb, the state's leading expert on bear behavior. "Dr. Webb, this is Dr. Sinclair at Pine Ridge," she said quietly into the radio, keeping her voice low so as not to agitate the bear further. "I need you to listen very carefully to what I'm about to tell you, because you're not going to believe it." As Ruby began to describe the situation, she watched the mother bear's condition continue to deteriorate. The animal was still standing guard over Emma, but Ruby could see the effort it was taking. The bear's breathing had become more labored, and there was a slight tremor in her muscles that indicated she was fighting to stay conscious. Meanwhile, Emma had begun to stir in her crib, making small fussing sounds that immediately caught the mother bear's attention. Despite her weakened state, the bear turned toward the baby and began making soft, comforting rumbles deep in her throat. The sound seemed to soothe Emma back toward sleep, but Ruby realized this created a new problem. The bear was using what little energy she had left to comfort the baby, energy she desperately needed to fight off the effects of blood loss. Dr. Webb's voice crackled through the radio, filled with disbelief and scientific curiosity. "Ruby, what you're describing is unprecedented. I've studied bear behavior for 30 years, and I've never heard of anything like this. Are you absolutely certain the bear is protecting the baby? Not stalking her?" "Marcus, she brought the baby a bottle," Ruby said urgently. "She picked it up in her mouth and brought it to her. She's reopened her surgical wounds trying to take care of this child. This isn't predatory behavior. This is maternal adoption across species lines." The silence on the radio stretched for what felt like hours, though it was probably only seconds. Ruby could hear Captain Morrison and his team growing more restless outside the door, their voices becoming more urgent as they discussed whether to enter by force. "Dr. Sinclair," Captain Morrison called out, his tone more authoritative now. "We need to come in and assess the situation. You've been isolated here for 2 weeks, and we need to make sure you and the baby are safe." Ruby's heart pounded as she realized she was running out of time. The rescue team would enter the cabin soon, with or without her permission. When they saw the scene inside, they would react according to their training, neutralize the threat to the human infant. The mother bear, weak from blood loss and operating on pure maternal instinct, would try to defend Emma and her cub. The confrontation would end in tragedy for everyone. That's when Emma chose that moment to wake up completely, her small voice rising in another cry for attention. But this time, her cry sounded different, not the desperate wail of hunger from before, but the fussing of a baby who had grown accustomed to comfort and was seeking reassurance. The mother bear responded immediately, moving closer to the crib despite her obvious pain. She began making a sound Ruby had never heard from any bear before. A gentle, almost musical humming that seemed to blend the natural vocalizations of a bear with something remarkably similar to a human lullaby. Emma's crying stopped instantly, replaced by the soft cooing sounds babies make when they feel safe and loved. She reached her tiny hands up toward the massive bear looming over her crib, and the bear carefully lowered her head so that Emma's fingers could brush against her fur. The sight was so tender, so impossibly beautiful, that Ruby felt tears streaming down her face. Here was proof that love could transcend every boundary, species, instinct, even the basic laws of nature that said predator and prey could never coexist peacefully. Dr. Webb's voice crackled through the radio again, filled with wonder and urgency. "Ruby, I'm driving toward your location now, but I'm still 3 hours away. You need to document everything you're seeing. This could revolutionize our understanding of animal cognition and cross-species bonding. But more importantly, you need to keep everyone safe until I can get there." The sound of a key turning in the lock made Ruby's blood run cold. Captain Morrison had apparently decided to use the emergency key she had given the ranger station years ago. In seconds, the door would open, and this miraculous scene would turn into a nightmare. "Jake, wait!" Ruby called out desperately, but it was too late. The door swung open, and Captain Morrison stepped into the cabin, followed by 2 other rescue workers. The sight that greeted them stopped all 3 men dead in their tracks. The massive brown bear, blood seeping through her bandages, stood protectively over a human baby's crib, while her small cub pressed against her side. The baby was awake and calm, reaching up toward the bear with complete trust, while the bear gazed down at her with unmistakable tenderness. For a moment, nobody moved. The rescue workers stood frozen in the doorway, their minds struggling to process what they were seeing. Ruby held her breath, watching as years of training warred with the evidence of their own eyes. Captain Morrison's hand moved slowly toward the tranquilizer gun on his belt, his training taking over despite the peaceful scene before him. "Dr. Sinclair," he said quietly, his voice tight with controlled tension, "step away from the bear slowly. We're going to handle this." "No, Jake, you don't understand," Ruby said urgently, moving to position herself between the rescue team and the bear family. "She's not a threat, she's protecting the baby." "Ruby, that's a wild bear standing over an infant," Morrison replied, his voice firm but gentle. "I know you've been isolated and under stress, but you need to let us do our job." The mother bear sensed the new tension in the room. Her protective stance intensified, and she let out a low warning growl that made all 3 rescue workers take a step back. But the growl wasn't directed at Emma. It was directed at the strangers who had invaded her den. Emma, seemingly oblivious to the danger, continued to reach toward the bear, making happy babbling sounds. The contrast between the baby's trust and the adult's fear created a tension so thick it seemed to fill the entire cabin. The cub, sensing his mother's distress, moved to position himself between her and the newcomers. Despite his small size, his intent was clear. He would defend his family, including the human baby his mother had claimed. "Look at them," Ruby pleaded, her voice breaking with emotion. "Really look at them. That bear is dying from blood loss because she hurt herself trying to feed Emma. She brought her a bottle, Jake. She fed a human baby." Captain Morrison's eyes flickered with uncertainty as he took in the details Ruby was pointing out. The blood on the floor, the careful positioning of the bears around the baby, the completely calm state of the infant, none of it fit the profile of a dangerous situation. "That's impossible," said one of the other rescue workers, a young man Ruby didn't recognize. "Bears don't feed human babies. They eat them." The mother bear's head snapped toward the man who had spoken, her eyes flashing with what could only be described as indignation. She moved closer to Emma's crib, as if the suggestion that she might harm the baby was personally offensive to her. Ruby watched the standoff developing and realized that words alone weren't going to convince the rescue team of what they were witnessing. She needed to show them the bond that had formed between the bear and Emma. Moving slowly and deliberately, Ruby approached the mother bear. The animal watched her carefully but didn't retreat or show signs of aggression. When Ruby reached the crib, she gently lifted Emma into her arms. "Watch," Ruby said softly, and then she did something that made all three rescue workers gasp in alarm. She held Emma out toward the mother bear. The bear's response was immediate and unmistakably tender. She lowered her massive head and gently nuzzled the baby's tiny hand with her nose, making soft rumbling sounds of affection. Emma giggled and grasped at the bear's fur, showing no fear whatsoever. "My God," Captain Morrison breathed, his hand moving away from his weapon. "She really is protecting her." But their moment of understanding was shattered by a commotion outside the cabin. More vehicles were arriving. Ruby could hear the distinctive sound of official government trucks and the radio chatter of what sounded like a larger response team. Dr. Webb's voice crackled urgently through Ruby's radio. "Ruby, I just got word that Fish and Wildlife has dispatched a containment team to your location. They received reports of a dangerous bear situation involving a human infant. They're authorized to use lethal force if necessary." Ruby's heart sank as she realized that their small miracle was about to be destroyed by bureaucracy and protocol. The containment team would arrive with orders to neutralize a threat to human life. They wouldn't take the time to observe and understand what was really happening here. The mother bear seemed to sense the approaching danger. Despite her weakened condition, she moved to place herself more firmly between Emma and the door. The cub pressed close to his mother's side, his small body trembling, but his stance determined. Emma, still in Ruby's arms, began to fuss as she picked up on the tension filling the room. Immediately, the mother bear began making her soothing humming sounds, and Emma calmed down. "We have to get them out of here," Ruby said urgently to Captain Morrison. "If that containment team arrives and sees this scene, they'll kill her before asking questions." Morrison looked torn between his duty to follow protocol and the evidence of his own eyes. "Ruby, I can't just ignore a potentially dangerous wildlife situation. And I can't help you hide a bear, especially one that's been in contact with a human infant. Then you'll be responsible for destroying something miraculous," Ruby said fiercely. "This bear has shown us that love and compassion exist beyond species boundaries. She's proven that maternal instinct can overcome every natural barrier. Are you really going to let them kill her for the crime of caring too much?" The sound of multiple vehicles approaching grew louder, and Ruby could see through the cabin windows that at least 4 official trucks had arrived. Men in uniform were getting out, and she could see they were carrying weapons designed to handle large, dangerous animals. Time was running out, and Ruby found herself facing an impossible choice. She could comply with the arriving officials, hand over Emma, and watch as they destroyed the bear family that had shown such incredible compassion. Or she could take a stand and risk everything to protect this unprecedented bond. As the footsteps of the containment team approached the cabin door, Ruby looked down at Emma in her arms, then at the bleeding bear who had sacrificed her own well-being to care for this human child, and then at the small cub who had helped make it all possible. In that moment, Ruby Sinclair made a decision that would either save them all or destroy any credibility she had ever built as a wildlife professional. She handed Emma back to Captain Morrison and turned to face the mother bear. "I'm going to ask you to trust me one more time, Mama," she whispered to the massive animal. "But this time, we're all going to have to be very, very brave." The cabin door burst open, and 6 heavily armed wildlife officers stormed in, expecting to find a hostage situation. Instead, they found something that would challenge everything they thought they knew about the natural world and force them to confront the possibility that some bonds are stronger than any law, natural or otherwise. The lead officer, a stern-faced man with graying hair and cold blue eyes, raised his tranquilizer rifle the moment he spotted the mother bear. His name tag read Commander Hayes, and everything about his posture suggested he was a man who followed protocol without question. "Everyone down on the ground," Hayes barked, his weapon trained on the mother bear. "Dr. Sinclair, step away from the animal immediately." But the mother bear's reaction to this aggressive intrusion was not what anyone expected. Instead of becoming defensive or aggressive, she seemed to collapse in on herself, her massive body trembling with a combination of blood loss, exhaustion, and what could only be described as heartbreak. The bear looked from the armed men to Emma, who was still in Captain Morrison's arms, and let out a sound that Ruby had never heard before, a low, mournful keening that seemed to contain all the grief of a mother being separated from her child. Emma heard that sound and immediately began crying, reaching her small arms toward the bear with desperate urgency. It was clear that in the short time they had been together, the baby had formed an attachment to her unlikely protector. "Lower your weapons," Ruby said firmly, stepping between Commander Hayes and the bear family. "This animal is not a threat. She's a patient who needs immediate medical attention." "Dr. Sinclair, you've been compromised," Hayes replied without lowering his rifle. "Extended isolation can cause people to form unhealthy attachments to dangerous animals. We're here to resolve this situation safely." "Compromised?" Ruby's voice rose with indignation. "I'm a trained wildlife veterinarian with 15 years of experience. I know the difference between dangerous and protective behavior." The cub, sensing the hostile energy from the armed men, pressed closer to his mother and began making distressed whimpering sounds. The mother bear, despite her weakened condition, moved to shield her baby with her body, though the effort sent fresh waves of blood seeping through her bandages. Dr. Webb's voice crackled urgently through Ruby's radio. "Ruby, I'm 20 minutes out. Whatever you do, don't let them tranquilize her while she's already weak from blood loss. The combination could kill her." Commander Hayes heard the radio transmission and his expression hardened. "Dr. Sinclair, turn off that radio and step aside. We have our orders." "Your orders are based on incomplete information," Ruby shot back. "This bear saved a human baby's life. She fed her, comforted her, protected her. If you kill her, you'll be destroying something miraculous." One of the younger officers, a woman with kind eyes and a nervous expression, lowered her weapon slightly. "Commander, maybe we should observe the situation for a few minutes before taking action. The baby doesn't appear to be in immediate danger." Hayes turned his cold stare on the officer. "Officer Martinez, raise your weapon. We don't have time for observation." But Officer Martinez hesitated, her gaze moving between the armed commander and the heartbreaking scene before her. The mother bear was now lying on her side, too weak to stand, but still positioning herself protectively around Emma's crib. The cub had curled up against his mother's belly, his small body shaking with fear and confusion. Captain Morrison, still holding Emma, found himself caught between his duty to protect the baby and his growing understanding that the real threat wasn't the bear. It was the men with guns who couldn't see past their own preconceptions. "Jake," Ruby said quietly, "you saw what I saw. You know this bear isn't dangerous. Don't let them destroy this." Morrison looked down at Emma, who was still reaching toward the weakened bear and crying softly. Then he made a decision that surprised everyone, including himself. "Commander Hayes," Morrison said, his voice steady and authoritative, "as the ranking local law enforcement officer, I'm declaring this cabin a crime scene pending investigation. No one fires a weapon until we've fully assessed the situation." Hayes whirled around to face Morrison, his face flushing with anger. "You have no authority over a wildlife situation, Captain. Stand down." "Actually, I do," Morrison replied calmly. "This cabin contains evidence of potential illegal activity, specifically the abandonment of a human infant. Until we determine exactly what happened here and how this bear became involved, this is a law enforcement matter." Ruby felt a surge of hope as she realized that Morrison was buying them time, using bureaucratic jurisdiction disputes to prevent immediate action against the Bear family. But Commander Hayes wasn't easily deterred. "Fine, you have 5 minutes to conduct your investigation, and then we proceed with containment protocols." Those 5 minutes felt like both an eternity and no time at all. Ruby knelt beside the mother bear, quickly examining her wounds while speaking in soothing tones. The bear was frighteningly weak now, her breathing shallow and rapid. The stress of the confrontation had accelerated her blood loss. "She's going into shock," Ruby announced, loud enough for everyone to hear. "If she doesn't get immediate medical attention, she'll die. And it won't be from tranquilizer darts. It'll be from blood loss caused by her efforts to care for a human baby." Officer Martinez took a step closer, her weapon now pointing at the floor. "Dr. Sinclair, are you saying this bear actually fed the baby?" "I'm saying she brought Emma a bottle when she was crying from hunger," Ruby replied, applying pressure to the bear's wounded paw. She stood up on her injured legs, reached for the bottle, and brought it to her. She hurt herself trying to take care of a human child. The young officer's eyes widened with wonder and disbelief. That's impossible. Bears don't do that." "This bear did," Captain Morrison added, his voice filled with quiet amazement. "I saw it myself. She was protecting the baby, not threatening her." Emma, still in Morrison's arms, suddenly stopped crying and made a small cooing sound. Everyone in the cabin turned to look at her, and what they saw made several of the officers gasp. The baby was holding out her tiny hand toward the weakened mother bear, her fingers opening and closing as if trying to reach her protector. And the bear, despite her pain and weakness, lifted her massive head just enough to gently nuzzle Emma's outstretched hand with her nose. The gesture was so tender, so unmistakably loving, that it silenced every argument about dangerous wildlife behavior. Even Commander Hayes lowered his weapon slightly, his stern expression flickering with uncertainty. "I've never seen anything like this," Officer Martinez whispered, tears visible in her eyes. "She really does love that baby." The moment was interrupted by the sound of another vehicle arriving outside, this one moving fast and skidding to a stop in the gravel. Through the window, Ruby could see Dr. Webb jumping out of his truck, a medical bag in one hand and a thick folder of documents in the other. "That's Dr. Marcus Webb," Ruby announced to the room. "He's the state's leading expert on bear behavior, and he's been monitoring this situation." Dr. Webb burst through the cabin door, taking in the scene with the trained eye of a scientist and the wonder of someone witnessing the impossible. He was a tall, lean man in his 60s with wild gray hair and intelligent eyes that immediately focused on the mother bear's condition. "She's in hemorrhagic shock," he said without preamble, dropping to his knees beside Ruby. "How long has she been bleeding like this?" "About an hour," Ruby replied, working alongside him to assess the bear's vital signs. She reopened her surgical wounds, trying to help the baby. Dr. Webb looked up at Commander Hayes with an expression of barely contained fury. "Commander, if you tranquilize this animal in her current condition, you'll kill her. She's already lost too much blood to safely process additional drugs." "Dr. Webb, this bear poses a threat to human life," Hayes replied, though his voice lacked its earlier conviction. We have protocols to follow. Protocols based on normal bear behavior, Dr. Webb shot back. But this isn't normal bear behavior. This is unprecedented cross-species maternal adoption, and if you destroy it without studying it, you'll be setting back our understanding of animal cognition by decades. While the two experts argued, Ruby noticed something that made her heart race with fear. The mother bear's eyes were starting to glaze over, and her breathing was becoming increasingly labored. She was slipping deeper into shock, and without immediate intervention, she would die regardless of what the wildlife officers decided to do. "We're losing her," Ruby said urgently. "Marcus, we need to operate now, or we'll lose any chance of saving her." Dr. Webb immediately began unpacking medical supplies from his bag. "Commander Hayes, I'm exercising my authority as a state wildlife expert to declare this animal a research subject under the Emergency Wildlife Protection Act. Any interference with her medical treatment constitutes a federal offense." Hayes looked uncertain for the first time since entering the cabin. "Dr. Webb, I have direct orders from—" "I don't care what orders you have," Dr. Webb interrupted, preparing a syringe of medication to stabilize the bear's blood pressure. "This animal has demonstrated cognitive abilities that could revolutionize our understanding of animal intelligence. She's more valuable to science alive than she is dead in your incident report." As Dr. Webb worked to stabilize the mother bear, something extraordinary happened. The cub, who had been cowering against his mother's side, suddenly stood up and moved toward Emma's crib. Everyone in the cabin held their breath as the small bear approached the baby. Captain Morrison instinctively tightened his grip on Emma, but he didn't back away. The cub stood on his hind legs and gently placed his tiny paws on the edge of the crib, looking directly at Emma with his dark, intelligent eyes. Emma stopped fussing immediately and reached out to touch the cub's paw. The moment their skin and fur made contact, both babies seemed to relax completely. Emma made happy babbling sounds while the cub responded with soft chirping noises that sounded remarkably like a human baby's coos. "They're communicating," Officer Martinez breathed in amazement. "They're actually communicating with each other." Dr. Webb paused in his medical work to witness this interaction, his scientific mind racing to process what he was seeing. "This changes everything we know about interspecies bonding," he murmured. "These animals have formed a family unit that includes a human infant. The implications are staggering." Commander Hayes watched the scene with growing uncertainty. His training told him to view the bears as dangerous wildlife that needed to be contained. But the evidence before his eyes suggested something entirely different, something that challenged every assumption he had ever made about the natural world. "Dr. Webb," Hayes said slowly, "assuming we allow this medical treatment to continue, what exactly are you proposing? We can't just leave a wild bear in a cabin with a human baby indefinitely." "Actually, Commander, that's exactly what I'm proposing," Dr. Webb replied, never pausing in his work on the mother bear. "At least until we can study this phenomenon properly. This bear has demonstrated maternal care toward a human infant. She's teaching us that the boundaries between species aren't as rigid as we always believed." Ruby felt a surge of hope as she realized that Dr. Webb was not only trying to save the mother bear's life, but also fighting to preserve the remarkable family unit that had formed in this remote cabin. But their hope was short-lived. The radio on Commander Hayes' belt crackled to life with an urgent message. "Commander Hayes, this is dispatch. We've received reports of media crews heading toward your location. Estimated arrival time is 30 minutes. Please advise on containment status." Hayes' expression hardened as he processed this information. Media attention would mean public scrutiny, questions about protocol, and potential criticism of any decision he made. The political pressure to resolve the situation quickly and definitively would be enormous. "Dr. Webb, you have 20 minutes to stabilize the animal for transport," Hayes announced. "Then we're moving everyone to a secure facility where this situation can be properly evaluated." "Transport will kill her," Ruby protested. "She's too weak to be moved safely." "Then I suggest you work quickly," Hayes replied coldly. "Because in 20 minutes this situation becomes a public relations nightmare, and my superiors will demand immediate resolution." Dr. Webb looked up from his patient with determination burning in his eyes. "Then we'd better perform a miracle," he said to Ruby, "because I'm not letting this family be destroyed by bureaucracy and fear." As the clock ticked down toward the arrival of the media, Ruby and Dr. Webb worked frantically to save the mother bear's life, while the most unlikely family in the world faced the possibility of being torn apart forever. The cabin that had been a sanctuary for healing and impossible love was about to become the center of a media storm that would force the entire world to question everything they thought they knew about the boundaries between species. But unknown to everyone in that cabin, Emma had been quietly developing a plan of her own. A plan that would soon shock everyone and prove that sometimes the smallest voices can change the world in the most unexpected ways. The sound of approaching helicopters could be heard in the distance, carrying news crews eager to capture what they assumed would be a routine wildlife containment story. They had no idea they were about to witness something that would challenge humanity's understanding of love, family, and the remarkable connections that can form when different species discover they share the same heart. As the helicopters grew louder, something extraordinary began to happen inside the cabin. Emma, who had been quietly observing everything from Captain Morrison's arms, suddenly began making sounds that none of the adults had heard from her before. They weren't cries or babbles. They were deliberate, rhythmic vocalizations that sounded remarkably similar to the gentle rumbling noises the mother bear had been making. The mother bear, despite her weakened condition and Dr. Webb's urgent medical ministrations, immediately responded to Emma's sounds. Her eyes, which had been growing dim with shock and blood loss, suddenly focused with startling clarity on the human baby. "What is she doing?" Officer Martinez whispered, moving closer to observe this unprecedented interaction. Ruby paused in her work, assisting Dr. Webb to watch as Emma continued her unusual vocalizations. The baby's sounds were becoming more complex, more intentional, as if she were trying to communicate something specific to the bear. The cub, still standing beside Emma's crib, began responding to both his human sister and his biological mother. He made soft chirping sounds that seemed to bridge the gap between Emma's attempted bear language and his mother's natural vocalizations. "She's trying to talk to her," Ruby breathed in amazement. "Emma is trying to speak bear language." Dr. Webb looked up from his patient, his eyes wide with scientific wonder. Babies are natural mimics. She's been listening to the bear's vocalizations for hours and learning to replicate them. This is evidence of cross-species language acquisition in human infants, something that was thought to be impossible. But what happened next made everyone in the cabin question everything they thought they knew about communication between species. The mother bear, summoning strength that shouldn't have existed in her weakened state, began responding to Emma's vocalizations with increasingly complex sounds of her own. The conversation, for that's what it clearly was, continued for several minutes. Emma would make a series of sounds, the cub would add his own vocalizations, and the mother bear would respond with gentle rumbles and soft growls that seemed to carry meaning beyond simple animal communication. Commander Hayes, who had been growing increasingly agitated about the approaching media, found himself transfixed by this impossible dialogue. "Dr. Webb, Are you telling me that Baby is actually communicating with a wild bear? Commander, I'm telling you that Baby has learned to communicate with a bear in the span of a few hours, Dr. Webb replied, without taking his eyes off his patient. She's demonstrating cognitive abilities that could revolutionize our understanding of early childhood development and interspecies communication. The sound of vehicles arriving outside interrupted this remarkable exchange. Through the cabin windows, Ruby could see news vans with satellite dishes unloading equipment, while reporters and camera operators prepared for what they assumed would be a standard wildlife story. "They're here," Hayes announced grimly. 20 minutes and then we move to containment protocols regardless of the animal's condition. But Emma seemed to understand that time was running out for her unlikely family. Her vocalizations became more urgent, more insistent, and the mother bear responded with sounds that conveyed distress and determination in equal measure. Dr. Webb had managed to stabilize the bear's blood pressure and slow the bleeding, but she was still far too weak for transport. "Commander, I need at least 2 more hours to get her stable enough to move safely. Any attempt to transport her now will kill her." "Doctor, I don't have 2 hours," Hayes replied tersely. "In 15 minutes there will be news cameras broadcasting this situation to the entire country. My superiors will demand immediate action." That's when Ruby noticed something that made her heart race with a mixture of hope and terror. The mother bear was trying to stand up again, despite her critical condition and Dr. Webb's protests. Her movements were weak and unsteady, but her intent was unmistakable. She was trying to position herself between Emma and the door, preparing to make one final stand to protect her adopted daughter. "She knows," Ruby whispered. Somehow, she understands that they're coming to separate her from Emma. The cub seemed to sense his mother's distress and his own impending separation from the human baby he had come to love. He climbed into Emma's crib, an action so gentle and deliberate that it left everyone speechless, and curled up beside her protectively. Emma immediately snuggled against the cub's warm fur, making contented cooing sounds while the young bear wrapped his small arms around her in an unmistakably protective embrace. The sight of a human baby and a bear cub cuddling together like siblings would have been unbelievable if they weren't witnessing it with their own eyes. "Get a picture of this," Officer Martinez said urgently to one of her colleagues. "Document everything. People need to see this." But Commander Hayes immediately countermanded the order. "No photographs. The situation is classified until proper authorities determine how to handle it." Dr. Webb's voice cut through the tension with scientific authority. "Commander, this documentation could be crucial for understanding what we're witnessing here. You could be suppressing evidence of the most significant breakthrough in animal behavior research in decades." Outside, Ruby could hear reporters setting up their equipment and preparing for live broadcasts. She knew that once the media got hold of this story, everything would change. The pressure for quick, decisive action would become overwhelming, and the subtle, patient approach needed to preserve this remarkable family would be impossible. The mother bear, sensing the growing tension and the approach of strangers, made a sound that Ruby had never heard from any animal before, a deep, mournful call that seemed to contain all the love and desperation of a mother facing the loss of her child. Emma responded immediately to this call, reaching out toward the bear with both arms while making urgent vocalizations of her own. The baby's distress was so evident that Captain Morrison found himself stepping closer to the bear rather than away from her. "She wants to say goodbye," Morrison said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "The baby knows they're going to be separated." Dr. Webb looked up from his medical work with tears in his eyes. "We can't let this happen. This bear has demonstrated cognitive abilities, emotional depth, and cross-species empathy that science said was impossible. If we destroy this bond, we're destroying living proof that love transcends every boundary we thought existed in nature. The sound of footsteps on the cabin's front porch announced the arrival of the first wave of media representatives. Ruby could hear voices discussing camera angles and lighting setups, completely unaware of the life-and-death drama unfolding inside. "Dr. Sinclair," came a voice from outside. "This is Janet Torres from Channel 7 News. We'd like to get a statement about the wildlife situation here." Commander Hayes immediately moved toward the door, clearly intending to control the narrative and present the situation as a routine containment operation. But as he reached for the door handle, something stopped him cold. Emma had begun crying. Not the hungry or uncomfortable crying from before, but the heartbroken sobbing of a child who understands that she's about to lose someone she loves. The sound was so raw, so full of genuine grief, that it seemed to pierce the heart of everyone in the cabin. The mother bear responded to Emma's distress with renewed determination. Despite Dr. Webb's protests and her own critical condition, she managed to struggle to her feet and move toward Emma's crib. Each step left drops of blood on the floor, but her focus was entirely on comforting the crying baby. When she reached the crib where Emma lay sobbing alongside the protective cub, the mother bear did something that brought tears to every eye in the cabin. She began to sing. The sound that emerged from her throat was unlike anything any of them had ever heard from a wild animal. It was a gentle, melodic humming that carried the unmistakable rhythm and cadence of a lullaby. The bear was singing a lullaby to comfort a human baby, using vocalizations that seemed to blend natural bear sounds with something remarkably similar to human music. Emma's crying immediately subsided as she listened to this impossible lullaby. She reached up toward the massive bear, and the bear carefully lowered her head so that Emma could touch her face. The baby's tiny fingers traced the bear's features with the trust and love of a child touching her mother. "My God," whispered Officer Martinez, her weapon now completely forgotten. "She's singing to her." Dr. Webb had stopped his medical work entirely, transfixed by what he was witnessing. "This is beyond unprecedented. This bear is demonstrating musical ability, emotional expression, and maternal behavior toward a human infant. This changes everything we know about animal cognition." The lullaby continued for several minutes, creating an atmosphere of profound peace in the cabin despite the chaos and tension surrounding them. Even Commander Hayes seemed affected by the tender scene, his stern expression softening as he watched the dying bear use her last strength to comfort a human child. But the spell was broken by an urgent knocking on the cabin door. "Dr. Sinclair, this is Deputy Chief Williams from the County Sheriff's Department. We need to speak with you immediately about the infant in your care." Ruby's heart sank as she realized that another layer of bureaucracy was about to complicate an already impossible situation. The arrival of Child Protective Services meant that not only was the Bear family in danger of being separated, but Emma might be taken away from everyone who had been caring for her. "Don't answer it," Dr. Webb said urgently. "We need more time to stabilize her condition and document what's happening here." But Commander Hayes was already moving toward the door. "Dr. Webb, we can't ignore official requests indefinitely. This situation has to be resolved." As Hayes reached for the door handle, the mother bear seemed to understand that this was the moment of final separation. She looked directly at Ruby with eyes that conveyed a desperate plea, then gently nuzzled Emma one last time before stepping back to allow whatever was about to happen. The cub, still curled protectively around Emma, tightened his embrace and made soft whimpering sounds that clearly communicated his unwillingness to be separated from his human sister. Emma, sensing the finality of the moment, began reaching frantically toward the mother bear while making the urgent vocalizations she had learned. her attempts to speak in bear language becoming more desperate as she tried to communicate something crucial to her protector. Ruby watched this heartbreaking scene and realized that Emma was trying to tell the bear something important that none of the adults had understood. The baby's vocalizations had become increasingly specific and urgent, as if she were trying to convey a message that could save them all. "Wait," Ruby said suddenly, moving closer to Emma and listening intently to the sounds she was making. "She's not just babbling or copying the bear's sounds. She's trying to tell us something specific." Dr. Webb immediately focused his attention on Emma's vocalizations, his scientific training allowing him to detect patterns that others might miss. "You're right. She's using specific sound combinations repetitively. She's attempting to communicate complex information." The baby's urgent sounds continued, becoming more insistent as the adults finally began to pay attention to what she was trying to tell them. The mother bear responded to Emma's vocalizations with increased alertness, as if she understood the message even if the humans didn't. "What is she trying to say?" Officer Martinez asked, moving closer to observe this unprecedented attempt at cross-species communication. Ruby listened more carefully to Emma's sounds, trying to detect any patterns or meanings in the baby's desperate attempts to communicate. And then, suddenly, she heard it, a sound buried within Emma's vocalizations that made her blood run cold. Hidden within the baby's attempts at bear language was a word, a single, clear human word that changed everything they thought they knew about this situation. "Mama," Emma said clearly, looking directly at the mother bear. "Mama." The word hung in the air like a revelation, and everyone in the cabin suddenly understood what Emma had been trying to tell them. This wasn't just a case of a bear protecting a human baby. This was a case of a baby who had found her mother, regardless of species. But before anyone could fully process the implications of what they had just heard, the cabin door opened and Deputy Chief Williams stepped inside, followed by 2 social workers and a court order that would tear this impossible family apart, unless Ruby could find a way to prove that sometimes love really can conquer every obstacle that nature and law can create. The battle for this extraordinary family was about to begin, and the stakes had never been higher. Deputy Chief Williams stepped into the cabin with the confident authority of someone accustomed to handling difficult situations. But the scene that greeted him stopped him completely in his tracks. His eyes moved from the massive, bleeding bear to the human baby in the cub's protective embrace, to the tears streaming down the faces of hardened law enforcement officers. "What in God's name is happening here?" Williams whispered, his voice barely audible. The social worker behind him, a middle-aged woman named Sarah Chen, pushed past Williams to get a better view. She had come prepared to remove an abandoned infant from an unsafe environment. Instead, she found herself witnessing something that challenged every protocol she had ever learned. Emma, still looking directly at the mother bear, said the word again, clearer and more insistent this time. "Mama." The mother bear responded with a gentle rumble that conveyed unmistakable love and recognition. She took one careful step toward Emma, her wounded paw leaving another drop of blood on the floor, but her eyes filled with a tenderness that transcended species. "That baby just called a wild bear mama," Williams said slowly, as if saying the words would help him process what he was seeing. Sarah Chen, despite 20 years of experience in child welfare, found herself speechless. The protective behavior she was witnessing, the obvious bond between the baby and both bears, the gentle communication between them, none of it fit any framework she had for understanding family dynamics. Dr. Webb looked up from his patient, his hand still working to keep the mother bear stable. "Deputy Chief Williams, you're witnessing the most significant breakthrough in cross-species bonding ever documented. This bear has formed a maternal bond with a human infant, and the infant has reciprocated that bond. Dr. Webb, regardless of what's happening here, we have a court order to remove the child," Williams replied, though his voice lacked conviction. "She needs proper medical evaluation and placement in appropriate care." "She has proper care," Ruby said fiercely, moving to stand protectively near Emma's crib. "This bear has risked her life to protect and feed this baby. She's shown more maternal instinct than many human parents." The cub, sensing the tension and the threat to his family, tightened his protective hold around Emma. The baby responded by snuggling closer to him while continuing to reach toward the mother bear, her small voice repeating, "Mama," with increasing urgency. Commander Hayes, who had been silent during this exchange, suddenly spoke up. "Williams, I've been in law enforcement for 25 years and I've never seen anything like this. That bear is protecting the baby with her life. Look at her. She's dying from blood loss, but she won't leave that child's side." Outside, the sounds of the media circus were growing louder. Ruby could hear reporters trying to get information from anyone willing to talk, and she knew that in minutes this story would be broadcast around the world. Sarah Chen approached Emma's crib slowly, her trained eye assessing the situation. As a social worker, she was supposed to remove the child from any potentially dangerous environment. But what she saw defied every definition of danger she had ever learned. The cub looked up at her with intelligent, protective eyes, but made no aggressive moves. Instead, he gently nuzzled Emma's cheek and made soft, comforting sounds. Emma giggled and touched his nose, then looked back at the mother bear with pure love in her eyes. "This is impossible," Chen whispered. "Everything about this situation should be dangerous for the child, but she's clearly healthy, well cared for, and emotionally bonded to these animals." Dr. Webb's hands never stopped their medical work as he spoke. "Ms. Chen, you're looking at evidence that love and family bonds can transcend species. This bear has demonstrated cognitive abilities, emotional depth, and protective instincts that rival any human parent. She's teaching us that family isn't defined by genetics. It's defined by care, sacrifice, and unconditional love." The mother bear, as if understanding that her fate was being decided, struggled to her feet one more time. Dr. Webb protested, but she was determined to make one final statement. Moving with painful slowness, she approached the group of officials who held her family's future in their hands. When she reached them, she did something that would be remembered by everyone present for the rest of their lives. The massive bear lowered herself into a position of submission, her head bowed, her eyes looking up at them with unmistakable pleading. She was begging for her family. The sight of this powerful predator humbling herself to protect a human baby broke something inside everyone present. Officer Martinez began crying openly. Captain Morrison wiped tears from his eyes. Even Commander Hayes struggled to maintain his professional composure. But it was Deputy Chief Williams who finally broke the silence. "In 30 years of law enforcement, I've seen parents who would abandon their children for money, drugs, or convenience. And now I'm looking at a wild animal who's willing to die to protect a human baby she has no biological connection to." Sarah Chen knelt down beside the mother bear, her own eyes filled with tears. "What kind of care has this child received?" she asked Dr. Webb. "The best kind," Ruby answered before Dr. Webb could speak. "She's been fed, protected, comforted, and loved. This bear brought her food when she was hungry. She sang to her when she was upset. She positioned herself between Emma and any perceived threat. That's not animal behavior, that's motherhood." Emma, watching the adults discuss her fate, made a decision of her own. The 6-month-old baby managed to pull herself up in her crib and, in a display of determination that shocked everyone, climbed over the side. The cub immediately moved to support her, preventing her fall, and together they made their way to where the mother bear lay, weakened on the floor. Emma crawled directly to the bear's massive head and laid her small body against the animal's fur, wrapping her tiny arms around the bear's neck in an unmistakable hug. "Mama," she said one more time, her voice filled with all the love and trust that a baby can give. The mother bear, despite her critical condition, managed to lift her head just enough to gently nuzzle Emma's face. The sound she made was so tender, so full of love, that it seemed to fill the entire cabin with warmth. In that moment, Sarah Chen made a decision that would change protocol forever. "Deputy Chief Williams, I'm recommending that we defer removal of this child pending a full psychological and developmental evaluation. What I'm seeing here suggests that separation could cause severe emotional trauma to the infant." Williams looked around the cabin at the faces of hardened law enforcement officers, all of whom were silently pleading with him to make the right choice. Outside, he could hear reporters calling out questions, unaware that history was being made inside this small cabin. "Commander Hayes," Williams said slowly, "what would happen if we declared this area a research site under the protection of the State Wildlife Department?" Hayes understood immediately what Williams was proposing. "Research sites are protected from public interference. We could control access, ensure proper medical care for all parties, and allow Dr. Webb to study this phenomenon properly." Dr. Webb looked up from his patient with hope blazing in his eyes. "Deputy Chief, I guarantee you that what we're witnessing here will change our understanding of animal cognition, child development, and the nature of family bonds. This bear and this baby are teaching us that love truly has no boundaries." The sound of helicopter rotors grew louder outside as news crews prepared for live broadcasts. In minutes, the story would break worldwide, and the pressure for immediate action would become overwhelming. But Ruby noticed something that filled her with sudden hope. The mother bear's bleeding had slowed significantly under Dr. Webb's care, and her breathing was becoming stronger. She was going to survive. Emma, still cuddled against her adoptive mother, made happy babbling sounds that the bear answered with gentle rumbles. The cub curled up beside them both, creating a picture of interspecies family love that seemed to radiate peace throughout the cabin. Williams looked at this extraordinary scene, then at the court order in his hands, and made a decision that would echo through legal and scientific communities for years to come. "I'm declaring this situation a special circumstances case requiring extended evaluation," he announced. "The child will remain in the temporary custody of Dr. Sinclair under the supervision of Dr. Webb for a period of 60 days while we assess the unprecedented bonding situation." Commander Hayes nodded slowly. "And I'm declaring this entire area a protected research site under emergency wildlife protocols. Access will be strictly controlled to ensure the safety and well-being of all parties." Sarah Chen smiled through her tears. "I'll file the appropriate paperwork to support extended evaluation. This family needs time to be studied and understood, not separated." As the officials worked out the details of this unprecedented decision, Ruby knelt beside the bear family and felt overwhelmed by the miracle she had witnessed. Love had indeed conquered every obstacle, legal, scientific, and natural. Dr. Webb finished stabilizing the mother bear and sat back with exhaustion and amazement. She's going to make a full recovery, and Emma appears to be thriving under their care. We're going to have the opportunity to study the most remarkable family bond ever documented. Outside, as the first news reports began broadcasting the story of the bear who adopted a human baby, The world would struggle to understand what had happened in that remote cabin. Scientists would debate it, skeptics would question it, and millions of people would be moved to tears by it. But inside the cabin, surrounded by the warmth of unconditional love, Emma fell asleep safely in the protective embrace of her mother. A mother whose love had proven that the most important things in life cannot be defined by species, law, or convention. The mother bear, now stable and recovering, kept one protective paw positioned near her human daughter, while her biological cub curled up between them. Ruby, Dr. Webb, and the other officials watched over this impossible family, knowing they were witnessing something that would change the world's understanding of love itself. As night fell over Pine Ridge Forest, the most extraordinary family ever documented settled into peaceful sleep, proof that love really can conquer all, even the boundaries between species. Emma's tiny hand remained intertwined in her mother's thick fur, and the bear's gentle breathing created a lullaby that promised protection, devotion, and unconditional love for as long as both hearts continued to beat. In the morning, scientists would come to study them. Reporters would try to explain them. The world would struggle to understand them. But tonight, they were simply a family, bound not by blood or species, but by the strongest force in the universe. A mother's love for her child, and a child's complete trust in the mother who would sacrifice everything to keep her safe. The bear, who paused her own treatment to feed the baby first, had done more than save a human infant's life. She had proven that love recognizes no boundaries, and that sometimes the most profound families are formed not by birth, but by choice, sacrifice, and an unbreakable bond that transcends every rule nature thought it had written, the end.